Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our programming, Listening and Learning, a look at housing inequities in Houston. My name is Diana Zarzuelo, Senior Director of Community Philanthropy here at the Greater Houston Community Foundation. We're excited to see so many of you joining us today for this important topic. We're still getting a few folks in, but we'll go ahead and get started. Reviewing the registration list, we have a great audience representing donors we're honored to work with, business leaders, many of you involved in corporate social responsibility, foundation leaders, and a few nonprofit, government, and concerned citizen friends as well. It's truly a testament to each of you and your care for Houston and your fellow Houstonians that you're here. Thank you again for joining us this morning. As the foundation reflects and celebrates its 25th year, we've also adopted a new purpose statement, one that reflects our continued partnership with our donors and the intended impact of our work. We inspire and create meaningful and positive change with our donors and for our community. It has been a time of great reflection and urgency for GHCF and our community. In the past 6 months, and in partnership with many of you, our team has been working to respond to the pandemic crisis by dispersing critical relief funds, targeting the most vulnerable and disproportionately impacted communities throughout Houston. We have also been reflecting and actively working on our role in addressing systemic racism, beginning with us launching a new effort to develop a comprehensive, effective, and sustainable plan to address racial equity challenges within our organization and through our work. As a part of this, we will continue to offer programming with an equity lens. We will also continue to speak to disparities through data as a part of our new strategic initiative, Understanding Houston. Understanding Houston is a regional indicators initiative that offers an incredible set of independent data and trends on quality of life issues impacting the three-county region. With our strategic research partner, the Kinder Institute for Urban Research, we've aggregated over 200 quality of life indicators across 8 topics, 43 subtopics from 70 unique data sources for Harris, Fort Bend, and Montgomery counties. You can see these 8 quality of life topics here. And within many of these topics, we disaggregate the data by race, ethnicity, or income where possible. UnderstandingHouston.org is a resource for all of us to learn, engage, and act, to more deeply understand Houston's strengths and challenges and explore how we might work together in new ways that build a more vibrant Houston. We encourage each of you to visit UnderstandingHouston.org to explore the data and sign up for our newsletter to stay involved as we move forward. We also want to take a minute to thank every supporter of Understanding Houston to date, with a special thanks to our founding partners highlighted here that have made a significant multi-year commitment to this new initiative. And with that, we'll now turn our focus to our program today on housing in Houston. A home is among the most fundamental needs for every person and family. And across Houston, there's a growing collective sense more and more people are feeling vulnerable about their housing, their community, and their economic future in a rapidly changing landscape. There's also the undeniable fact that many communities of color, housing stability, and economic security have been persistently kept out of reach for decades. Today, Kyle Shelton from the Kinder Institute will start us off by digging into the data with a look at key housing trends, highlighting some of the most troubling housing inequities in Houston. Maria Aguirre Borrero from Avenue will offer a community perspective that speaks to how the lack of affordable housing impacts families in low-income communities. And then we'll turn it to our esteemed panel discussion, with each panelist bringing a unique perspective to this issue. Ann Gatling-Haynes from the Houston Land Bank, Paul Charles from Neighborhood Recovery Community Development Corporation, Zoe Middleton from Texas Housers, and Jonathan Brooks from Link Houston. Each of our speakers will start off with just a brief remarks, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with all of you. We encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You all received a link to our speakers' bios, but I'll speak to a few highlights for each of them, truly doing none of them full justice, really. I'll start off with Kyle. Kyle leads the research team on urban development, transportation, and urban metro governance at Kinder Institute. His research focuses on how the intersections of these issues and policies shape the built and natural environments of cities in the past and today. So Kyle, thanks for framing today's discussion.
Thanks, Dan, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to share my screen here to talk through our data overview. The Kinder Institute is really excited to partner with the Greater Houston Community Foundation on the Understanding Houston project, and I also want to extend my thanks to the sponsors of the project and the work, and all of you for joining us today to learn about our housing issues. A lot of this is also is pulled both from Understanding Houston and from the Kinder Institute's State of Housing report, which was also supported by Wells Fargo. So I want to give them a thanks for pulling double duty on both of these important initiatives. So a couple key findings that I'm going to talk through on our summary here today and lead into the panelists are across all three counties, Fort Bend, Montgomery, and Harris, affordability is becoming a bigger issue in the housing space. I'm going to look at Harris County and Houston in more detail as I go through, but I'm also going to keep a view of all three, the bigger picture Understanding Houston view as well. But I'm going to use Harris County and Houston as a deeper dive at points as well. And one of the really critical things to think about in the declining affordability is that as a region, we have a reputation of being a very affordable place, and that's increasingly at odds with the rising costs we're seeing in housing across the entire Houston area. And that's going to increasingly be a challenge for the entire region if we're continuing to try to attract residents and create a sustainable standard of life and quality of living. We need to make sure that we have safe and affordable housing to all folks from all incomes across the region. Even for median income households, buying a home is becoming more difficult because incomes have stayed relatively static and because housing prices have continued to grow across all three areas. Renter households of median income are less and less able to move into homeownership, and that's a big issue because it tightens the rental market and makes competition for the affordable stock that does exist more difficult, more tighter, and more difficult for lower income families to access homes. In that vein, low income renters in particular face significant hurdles in affording homes of all kinds in all three counties. One thing I'll touch on later in the discussion is that Montgomery and Fort Bend, for example, have an incredibly limited supply of subsidized units with public funding. And in both of those locations, that means, again, that the market for affordable rentals is very limited. And then another major issue in the housing realm is that Black home ownership rates are lower than every other major racial and ethnic group. And this is true across all three counties. And is rooted in both long-term historical trends that have contributed to the racial wealth gap and ongoing challenges such as recovering all the way back from the Great Recession and recovering from subsequent hurricanes and other disasters. So I'll talk through this. I'm happy to address questions in the Q&A after my discussion, but feel free to put them in now and I'll review as I finish. So as I mentioned, rising home values are occurring across all three counties. You can see here Fort Bend at the top. I'll use my cursor to kind of show. Fort Bend at the top has grown from 198,000, just under 200,000 in home values to 264,000 between 2010 and 2017. Harris similarly from 149,000 to 174,000, and Montgomery from 180 to 235,000. Those are the home values. So all three counties experienced an increase of more than 17% in Harris County's case and more than 30% in Montgomery and Fort Bend. And if we look even more closely at Harris County and Houston, as I said, I would dive in with sales prices, you can see that while values have gone up, the assessed value has gone up, the sales prices have gone up even higher. The market value has gone up even higher. In this case, probably holds similar for Fort Bend and Montgomery, but here's Harris County and the city of Houston. The red line is the city of Houston sales prices between 2011 and 2018. And sales prices in the city of Houston have gone all the way up to $270,000 in 2018. So well above that median value, almost $100,000 above the county average. And this is obviously a boon for current homeowners. Their major asset has increased in value and is very significant portion of most families' wealth. For folks, however, who are trying to enter into the home ownership ranks, this means that it's a significant challenge and that the costs are increasing every day. And for folks who are on fixed incomes, having higher and higher values and prices can be a major challenge in ensuring folks can stay in their homes, especially folks with lower incomes. I do also want to talk about the affordability gap, which is the challenge, really helps illustrate the challenge that folks have in being able to purchase homes. And the columns that I'll actually draw your attention to today are the gray columns here on the right, which is a renter household of median income. You can see that there's a significant gap in what they can afford without spending more than 30% of their household income on housing. In 2011, a median renter household could spend just about $100,000, just over $100,000 without stretching their budget too far on housing. And even in 2011, the median sales price in Harris County for a home was $139,000. So there was already a very significant gap between what a median renter household could afford and what was available on the market and what market prices were driving. If we switch to 2018 over here on the right, you can see that the gap has grown significantly. And again, it's both that incomes have only marginally grown, at least for median income households, right? It's what they can afford has inched up about above 120,000, but the median sales price in Harris County has gone up to 220,000. So again, just a huge challenge for median income households to be able to enter into the ranks of home ownership. And part of what that what is tied to that as well is the growth of median gross rent. And so again, the competition for affordable units and rental units has tightened and has increased. And so for households with lowest income, they're now facing competition with with households who have higher incomes and are also looking for affordable units. And so as we have a limited supply of affordable units, we're seeing competition across all renter households trying to get those, secure those units for themselves. And so we see the crunch most directly, as I said, with renter households. And you can see again that for Harris County and the city of Houston, rents have grown very considerably from 2010 to 2018. And what this all contributes to is cost burden. And I've already alluded to this once before. This is when a household spends more than 30% of its total income on housing, it's considered cost burden. If that household spends more than 50% of its income on housing, it's considered extremely cost burden. And Houston, like other major regions, has a major challenge with families spending too much money on their housing. And you can see that it's true across all three counties. So from 2010 to 2017, both Fort Bend and Montgomery experienced growth in the percentage of renters who were spending more than spending more than 30% of their income on housing. Harris County saw a slight decline between 2010 and 2017, but we've seen that inch back up in 2018. Again, it's very significant. It's a much more significant challenge for renters than homeowners. Homeowners across the board have seen their cost burden rates decline since 2010, and most of that is a signal of recovery from the Great Recession. But again, for many homeowners, the percentage of homeowners who are left who are still cost burden, many of them are lower income and have not been able to recover, and so are still spending an unsustainable amount on their housing costs. This is particularly problematic, as I have mentioned, for low-income households. Again, this is just Harris County, but if you look at renter burden just by income level, you can see all of the groups on the left. Any household whose income is less than $50,000 a year has a significantly higher cost burden there is significantly higher cost burden in those groups than on those income groups further to the right, higher income groups. And you can see, obviously, it's most stark for those who are making less than $35,000 a year. The vast majority of the renters whose households make less than $35,000 a year are burdened or extremely burdened. So spending a huge amount of money on housing, which makes the spending on every other necessity and need much more difficult. A lot of these trends are also seen in neighborhood redevelopment and gentrification and potential displacement. This is work from the Kinder Institute in 2018, which highlights the susceptibility of different neighborhoods to potential gentrification, which can contribute to displacement. And as we see here, and as I'll show you in the next slide, It overlaps a lot with income segregation, with concentrations of low-income households, and with growing housing costs. So many of the neighborhoods that we see here that are facing development pressures are seeing rising home prices, are seeing rising rents, and are seeing stagnant incomes for low-income households, which raises the opportunity for development to displace long-term residents. And you can see, I'll just toggle back to that previous one. So this map is the percent of household income by different community areas that are less than the median household income. The darker the color, the more households make less than the area median income. So you can see there's a very close overlap between those areas susceptible to gentrification and redevelopment and potential displacement, and those areas with high income segregation and significant populations of low-income households. And all of this, again, is also, it's really critical to think about how fast our renter population is growing. So we know that there are rising housing prices, fewer people are able to move into the ranks of homeownership. We know that rents are going up. We know that there are increasingly challenges in finding affordable rentals in many neighborhoods that have concentrations of low-income renters, and our population of renters is growing. And what that means, again, is that the overall supply is getting crunched considerably, and that leads to the need to really address that challenge and think about how we ensure that there's housing available for all. And on the supply side, one of the elements that's difficult to think about is that we're losing affordable units, as I've mentioned. So you can see here in 2010, the number of units that we're renting for less than $800 has declined significantly by the time we get to 2018. This is Harris County again. And the number of units renting for more than $1,500 has more than doubled. So the units that are coming online are often higher class units or luxury units. And many of the units that were once affordable have been renovated or updated to be charging a higher price point, or have been demolished and replaced with new units. So we're seeing a crunch there and the loss of affordable units. And the type of stock that is being built is either very much skewed towards single family. Obviously, it's the vast majority of housing types in Harris County. Again, this is Harris County, but also in the 3-county area, or very large multifamily. And one of the things that Houston and a lot of other regions struggle to provide is what's often called the missing middle, which are smaller multifamily units. Often that's what we think of as the NOAA units, naturally occurring affordable housing. And so that's really an area where we've seen a lot of the duplexes, quadplexes, smaller multifamily get removed. And that eliminates an opportunity to think about how we have more options for folks at neighborhood scales that can fall into the spectrum of housing between single family and major multifamily. And as I mentioned at the beginning as well, one of the major challenges that we're facing in the housing system is ensuring that the key asset for many American families, the home and home ownership, is available to all and equitably available to all. And for Black Houstonians and Black residents of our region, homeownership rates have continued to decline. Again, that's rooted not just in slow recovery from the Great Recession, but also in slow recovery to Hurricane Harvey and other disasters, and has historic antecedents that we need to acknowledge every time we have this conversation, which are rooted in segregation, are rooted in lending practices from the Federal Housing Administration, such as redlining. This is the redlining map of Houston from the 1930s. Basically every yellow or red neighborhood was a historically Black or brown community, and the lending practices underwritten by the federal government at that point ensured that homeowners could not take out loans to improve their homes, and so the values of homes declined. And it also was a way to enforce segregation and ensure that folks were kept into segregated neighborhoods, and lending was used as a tool to keep that segregation in force. And all of that contributes to the growth of the racial wealth gap that we see. Again, housing being the foundational piece of how most American households create wealth and then pass that wealth down to their descendants. that's a major issue. And given that the homeownership rate for African-American Houstonians has declined, it's going to continue to be something we should be paying a lot of attention to and thinking about if the goal is to try to improve the lives and improve the quality of life and close that racial wealth gap. Housing is a critical part of that. At the same time, one of the things we highlighted in our state of housing report is that there's also an inordinate amount of risk in a lot of lower income and Black and brown communities to climate change and to flooding, particularly in Houston. This map shows in the yellow areas of the city where homeownership has declined the most for Black homeowners, and also overlays flood risk. And you can see that there's very significant overlap between the two. And so not only are Black homeowners facing financial challenges, they're also facing environmental challenges that are contributing to impacts on their homes and to their wealth and their family's wealth. I want to just touch on another few key topics and then hand over to the panel for them to dive in even further. But I mentioned at the top subsidized units. So these are publicly subsidized units, either housing choice vouchers, formerly known as Section 8, or low-income housing tax credits. These are the two major subsidized programs used in Houston, Harris County, and in the 3-county area. And as you can see, the vast majority of these properties and of these vouchers are used in Harris County. And it's great that Harris County has that option and has these units, but it also speaks to the limitation of access for affordable housing in both Fort Bend and Montgomery, where we know that folks with lower incomes who are working in the service industry, working in retail, have a struggle to find housing that works for them and their budgets. Homelessness is obviously a major issue in Harris County and the 3-county area. And what we see from the Understanding Houston data is that we've been working had a very concerted effort with the Way Home initiative, and that seems to be working very well. The COVID challenges notwithstanding, previously the numbers of unsheltered folks had been declining very rapidly, and that's a combination of working with permanent supportive housing, using a housing first approach and getting folks into housing, and trying to address other challenges they're facing after they're in a safe and stable home. And so this has been a really positive data point. It's really going to be critical for us to continue to pay attention to how this has responded to COVID, especially with my next slide about evictions, thinking about households who are facing homelessness or challenges with being unhoused, even on a temporary basis. We're going to need to really focus on how we continue to address that issue. Some of the CARES Act money locally has gone to expanding shelter capacity and expanding that housing first response, which is hopefully going to continue these trends we see here. Evictions are probably one of the most direct ways for us to think about the COVID impacts. And these are two more recent elements that I wanted to highlight around evictions. On the left is information from January Advisors, who's been pulling cases directly from the Harris County legal system and identifying those. Their work has also underpinned the graph on the right, which is from the Eviction Lab, showing post-COVID evictions. What both of them together, I'll give a little bit more detail, show is that we're facing a major challenge in Houston. Since March, Houston leads the nation in the number of evictions, and over the past 20 years, Houston has had a huge number of evictions, which is often higher than what had been reported prior to this January Advisors data really being shared. There's a major crisis in evictions, and it's ongoing as we speak. And it is destabilizing to both the households who experience it and is very disruptive to the overall housing system that we are talking about today. And this is a major challenge that we need to keep thinking about addressing, and the work both of the city of Houston, Harris County, and the surrounding counties. It's a challenge that's facing everybody and isn't going away anytime soon as COVID continues. And then finally, I just want to end, obviously housing is connected to a lot of other pieces. The costs of housing, if I can return back to the cost burden for a second, thinking about that 30% of your income on housing. One of the other costs that's often tied to housing is transportation. I know Jonathan's on the panel after me and can also talk to this as well. These two costs, the cost of transportation and housing, are most households' major costs. And similarly, as we talk about not spending more than 30% of your income on housing. Often, increasingly, these two are being put together as well, and talking about the transportation, housing plus transportation costs, and aiming to minimize these for families as well. And you can see that, of course, in Fort Bend and Montgomery, where many households have people who are commuting long distances for work or for other opportunities, the costs are well above 50% of their household income. And again, the more that people are spending on sort of set costs like housing and transportation, the less they have available for education, healthcare, and many, many other opportunities. So it's also critical that we just acknowledge the connections housing has to these other systems and what those costs are. So I'm gonna stop there. Thank you for allowing me to present this to you today, and I hope that we've had lots of great foundations for the conversation. And again, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A, and I'll be happy to try to answer them as we go. And you can reach out afterwards. Thanks, Diana.
Thank you, Kyle. Yeah, great overview and framing in terms of the data highlights. We'll now be joined by Maria, who will share her perspective, sort of a community story and community voice, integrating residents' perspectives that she works with closely every day. Maria leads the Community Initiatives team at Avenue, an organization focused on building affordable homes. She engages deeply with low-income families and underserved communities in Houston to cultivate resident leadership and support community visioning and action, including around issues like affordable housing. So Maria, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Diana. Good morning, everybody. So I'm here to really tell you a short story before you can get to our wonderful panelists and can continue to be a part of this conversation. Kyle mentioned the AMI, the area median income of the city of Houston, a few times, but I want to give you a little bit of perspective when it comes to how that number can be a bit deceiving when it comes to affordable housing. And why do I say that? For example, the AMI in Harris County, I was looking it up this morning just to get the latest numbers, is $60,000. In the city of Houston, it's $51,000. So if we're building affordable housing based on these numbers, the issue comes when you're looking at communities like the one that I serve. I serve the Greater North Side, which is made up of basically several small to medium neighborhoods, and it's made up of about 150,000 people. The area median income of the neighborhoods I serve is $30,000. So when you're building affordable housing for the city of Houston for $50,000, that is not affordable for people in the neighborhoods I serve, for example. It is not affordable for people in the neighborhoods that a lot of the nonprofits serve. So when we look at an area median income, a median household income, we have to really consider what are the household median incomes in neighborhoods specifically, because what we've been experiencing so far is that when we let the city of Houston or the Harris County data guide us, it can be problematic for people in the neighborhoods that we serve because their reality is so different. So in preparation for today, I actually spoke to a few of our leaders and had a conversation with them about housing. They couldn't be with us today, but they gave me a lot to share with you. So I want to tell you about Alejandro. Alejandro is one of my most wonderful leaders. I met him 5 years ago because they saw him at a city meeting, and they recommended that I meet with him since he seemed to be engaged. Alejandro is 30 years old, 31, and he's been going to college for the last 10 years. He's been going to the University of Houston downtown for the last 10 years. And that is because he couldn't quite afford to pay for all his credits at the same time, because Alejandro makes $28,000 a year. And his greatest dream is to live in the neighborhood where he grew up, is to live in the neighborhood where he knows his neighbors, he knows the streets, he knows the businesses, he bikes everywhere, and where he feels connected. But his greatest fear right now is that he will not be able to stay there much longer. He will not be able to buy a house in the neighborhood that has always been his. So a quote from the conversation that we had was that he says, "I have been living here since '93, here in Northline. I have been in this area my whole life. I like the closeness, the big yards, knowing my neighbors, growing up with all the kids in the area. There's a connectedness that I really appreciate about my neighborhood. And I'm coming to an age where I really want to find a place. I want to stay here because this is my neighborhood. But I don't think I'm going to be able to live here anymore unless I live with my parents and my sisters and we all pull our money together. And the reality that Alejandro is going through, the reality that most of our leaders are going through, which is that they can't afford affordable housing in the city of Houston, and they're starting to figure out if they need to look elsewhere. They're starting to figure out if they would rather live all together in one place so that they can stay in the place that they've always called home. And we see this consistently, the situation that Alejandro faces and a lot of our families face. There are families of 4 with a median income of $32,000 a year. Affordable housing is nowhere near affordable for them. So when we talk about affordable housing, the message that I want to leave is that creating more affordable housing for the city of Houston is crucial, but creating more affordable housing for our low-income neighborhoods, that would be amazing, because then affordability would be accessible to everyone. And that's what Alejandro asks for. That's what our leaders ask for, is for affordability to be something that they can actually reach. This is what we see every day. So with that tidbit of Alejandro's life, with that tidbit of the work that we do, I just want to thank you for being here. I want to thank everyone who shared their information, and I'll be here if you have any questions or comments.
Thanks so much, Maria, for that powerful perspective. We know that there are hundreds of thousands of similar stories across Houston, each unique, but many with the common theme or thread of economic insecurity and the real challenges faced when trying to buy a home in today's market. We'll now turn to our panel discussion, beginning with Ann Gatling-Haynes of Houston Land Bank. Ann brings over 25 years of experience in community and economic development and is the first CEO of the Houston Land Bank in Houston. She's worked across a number of U.S. cities with a focus on catalyzing innovative public-private partnerships and strategic real estate investments to build more inclusive communities. So with Ann, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here today. And this is going to be a full packed agenda. So I will try and get through some slides to provide some context. I'm working at the Houston Land Bank, and I think next slide we can quickly go to. Just wanted to make sure that people knew who the Houston Land Bank was. We are a local government corporation, a creation of the city about 20 years ago. The board structure includes appointed members from the city of Houston, the Houston Independent School District, and Harris County. I will describe a little bit more about the history of the organization, but importantly, I represent probably on the panel the public sector view, and we are part of an ecosystem of entities within the space of creating affordable housing. So we're on the implementation side, but as you heard from both Kyle and Maria, and you will hear from others, we are far away from solving the affordable housing crisis that I think has been going on in Houston for a little bit, but it's really hitting kind of quite a point of inflection. So we can go to the next slide. Our mission is pretty straightforward as a land bank, and we really take abandoned and foreclosed and vacant property and really trying to put it back into productive use. There are land banks all over the country, but the land bank movement pretty much started within post-industrial cities, both in the Northeast and the Midwest, with lots of vacancies and lots of decline in some of the inner city neighborhoods in those cities. And the whole purpose is really to kind of put public entity to work to secure land for community purpose and public policy. And I think we can go to the next slide. We have had a history. So in 20 years, Houston, the city of Houston, and some of my founding board members were very insightful back in the 1999-2000 range to really put a land bank function as a program of the city. It was called the Land Assemblage Redevelopment Authority, and it really took properties from the foreclosure auction, generally ones that weren't selling at the auction, and cleared title, got them back and put on the market, sold to builders for affordable housing. As you can see in this graph, it just basically shows that most of the properties that are in our current database came into our inventory through the foreclosure crisis of 2006 through 10. And certainly at the time, which is interesting, at the foreclosure auction, and this is how the state legislation structures land bank functions, at that time, 40% of the properties were not sold at the auction, and then came into our inventory, and we sold them to builders to provide affordable housing, focused at 120% AMI, area median income, based on the desire to put workforce housing in some of the disinvested neighborhoods in the city. This just shows you that over time, through different mayoral administrations, the capacity of that program declined, and so fewer transactions were happening. And so in 2018, the city and its partners decided that really reviving that land bank function to put both the inventory we did have in our inventory back into productive use, but ultimately to start looking at how do we secure land now, given this market. The foreclosure auction now, less than 5% are not sold at the auction. It's a real estate market unto itself. And so we're looking at other ways of securing land for public purpose. And so we can keep going. Next slide. In the history of the organization, we've sold approximately 725 properties. We've put about $76 million value back into the market. We currently have about 75 properties in development, which is, when I came in about 2 years ago, we did a lot of auditing of our inventory and builders who had secured land from us and may have not built yet. So we really actually have a very active pipeline of construction. And I'll talk a little bit about the two programs in a second. One of the things that I think we really would like to be building our team for, we have an independent team of 8 people now, which before it was staffed by city employees who also had a different day job. And so now we really have a full team in action. And one of the things that we're really working on is how to become closer to the community leaders in the places where we have inventory, and certainly trying to build housing as quickly as possible in those locations based on community input. So let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a refined vision. As you can imagine, 20 years ago, the goal was really to build on single family lots, single family housing. Go to the next slide, please. With many of the city's initiatives, which is the majority of seats on my board, there's actually quite a few lenses that we're looking at our work right now. There's additional policy commitments for single family housing development, and also to increase affordable housing in some of these rapidly changing neighborhoods that you saw on Kyle's slides. Complete Communities is Mayor Turner's initiative to look at strategic neighborhoods in the city. I'm going to show a map in a second, which really vary in both their capacity, their needs, and what kinds of strategies we might deploy in terms of affordable housing. HCDD, which is the housing department, we work very, very closely with them, have announced 200 single family houses per year as a goal. And Resilient Houston, which is a very recent report by the City of Houston's Chief Resiliency Officer and extended team of people, that by 2050, there's a goal for 375,000 new homes across every income level. So significant push for housing at all of affordability types. Next slide. This is the map, which I'm not going to go into much detail, but the highlighted neighborhoods you can see include where our majority of our properties are, which were historically disinvested neighborhoods that are experiencing significant gentrification right now, especially towards the inner core, as well as neighborhoods that are the first 5 of 10 complete communities. The mayor just announced another 5 about 9 months ago, and those are not on this map yet, I highlighted. But you can see that actually, as we have many strategic neighborhoods in a fairly large geography, so we are trying to figure out how to adjust to solve many different issues in many different neighborhoods. And we have about 540 properties right now, and half of them are reserved for the housing department's initiative that I'll talk about in a second. Next slide, please. But this city is, I came 2 years ago to this position, but ultimately to Houston, I'd been traveling here to work with University of Houston students in the architecture school for about 15 years, fell in love with the city. It is filling in quick. There'll be more people like me. Fortunately, unfortunately, I think you can take both sides of the equation. But it's a naturally affordable place that is in growth mode. And now is the time to secure as much land as we can for public purpose. It is only going to continue to go up in cost, and it's only going to be more difficult for people in the neighborhoods that are so important to Houston to be able to secure their place in these neighborhoods. And that is our key focus. And land bank, as I said, is a key tool in a city's toolbox to secure property and then convert that property into productive use. I would say that we are not a developer, we are a connector. And we're really trying to secure that land, clean it, get it ready for productive development that secures public policy goals. Next one. That was a view from our office, which is in the Baker Ripley Center in Harrisburg Boulevard. We really feel strongly that building wealth through home ownership is an anchor to a community and an anchor opportunity for families. So all of our programs right now are in home ownership, not in home rental opportunities. Although we are starting to look at where we might help pipelines of buyers that may not be ready to purchase yet, but certainly are looking to secure a house in a neighborhood. We really care about neighborhoods and really not just the housing, but the other amenities that make a neighborhood whole. And that was one of the things from the older LARA program, that there weren't enough abilities to kind of bring grocery stores, make sure there's safe routes to school, parks, and other kinds of small business support to be able to create complete neighborhoods. So it's sort of the Affordable Housing Plus plan. And then there are a variety of neighborhood organizations, Avenue CDC in the north section, Paul, and many other CDCs around the city that may or may not have all the expertise necessary to do all the work in the neighborhoods that they have. And we'd really like to be the partner to all of those organizations that are really creating the best value for the communities. Next slide. And then just this is very quickly because it's really looking forward, and I do anticipate some question and answer that would start getting at some of these things. So let's go to the next one. We have two major programs that are focused at two affordability ranges. Our traditional program is focused on workforce housing up to 120% AMI. That equates to about a family of four of about $90,000 a year is the target and below. And some of our builders are actually working at more affordable pricing than this. And then the new home development program with the city is marketing to home buyers that are between below 80%, but with our partnership with the Houston Community Land Trust, we're able to stretch from 40 to 80% AMI. 80% AMI is about, for a family of four, $60,000. So they're still significantly higher than what Maria was mentioning in the north side. So it is really a big challenge. Next. Going forward, we really want to continue to have that spectrum of housing opportunities, housing choice, so that people in neighborhoods have choices of different types of products, as well as types of affordability ranges. And then essentially looking at larger sites that we can actually develop more efficiently to be able to provide additional amenities as well. Next. Really, and also partnering for expanded reach, back to that neighborhood focus I mentioned. Next slide. Looking forward, we're really working with our builders in the equation of how to get affordable housing. Land costs are rising, construction costs are rising, and wages are not rising nearly as fast. So prices are sort of we're trying to hold steady those prices. So we really are looking at innovations in home building so that we can probably get that construction cost down. We are significantly interested in making sure our builders are working with local communities in terms of local hiring, and we are working on a startup builder program to help bring some small neighborhood-based construction companies to be able to build and actually scale their own businesses. And as well, we'd really like to see additional amenities for neighborhoods where we can support some small businesses in these neighborhoods as well. And so that concludes my presentation. And I know that there'll be lots of questions later. So please put questions in the Q&A and I'll be happy to respond. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne. Next, we have Paul Charles. For more than 2 decades, Paul has led Neighborhood Recovery, CDC, in the development and redevelopment of affordable housing and commercial real estate projects in South Central Houston. Paul has worked on a number of large-scale master plan development projects, including acting as a key community convener for a multi-year initiative focused on revitalizing Old Spanish Trail. South Union continues today. So Paul, thanks for joining us.
So good morning, everybody, and here we go. So I'd like to talk to you about some of the realities of affordable housing. And I mean, we'll start with the question, is housing a privilege or should housing be a right? There's some stiff competition, as Kyle mentioned, for the shortage of decent and affordable units. And some of the reasons why that is because of difficulty developing near good performing schools and near job or work centers. There's the difficulty in creating mixed income communities. There's the discrimination about where needed units can be built or sited throughout the city. There's NIMBYism. And then there is also there's increased speculation in the market, which pushes up prices for land, materials, and other resources that would normally go into affordable housing. And if you have not had these speculators calling your house at least 7 times a day, I applaud you. It happens to me both at home as well as at the office. Property taxes. We're seeing property taxes rising at rates that exceed the market appreciation or above the increases in incomes. And that's a reality of what we're seeing in affordable housing. There's also the environmentally hazardous communities. You can look across this city. You've seen it on the news. You saw it on the news last week about communities who are suffering high incidences of cancer and other diseases. And those are communities where poor people live or where there have been opportunities for creating housing opportunities, but you have to strike that balance. You heard earlier from Kyle, Maria, as well as from Ann about affordability. And I also went to research, and according to the Houston Apartment Association, in September of 2020, the average price of a 2-bedroom unit was $1,118 a month. For a person who is earning minimum wage, it would take somebody working 600 hours just to afford that unit, with them only paying 25% of their income towards housing. Otherwise, you need an income of $25 an hour to afford this unit working a normal work week. The cost burden, as Kyle mentioned earlier. While the cost burden sounds like a term, the cost burden and the numbers that Kyle showed show an issue or a problem. And the reason why it is because it puts the person or the family at risk of financial collapse, or health risk, or job insecurity, or ultimately homelessness. And then on the ownership side, you've got a median price of the house, according to the Houston Association of Realtors in September 2020, of $265,000. And as Maria mentioned, for families who aren't earning that much, or who aren't earning the area median income in the city of Houston, that puts them at even more of a disadvantage to be on the ownership side. And we all know that owning a home is, for most people, their largest investment or their easiest way to have a stake in what we all consider to be the American dream. On the multifamily side, rising production costs are a reality of affordable housing. Earlier this year, there was a listing published of new construction units that were being funded using public funds. And the production costs on those units ranged anywhere from $152,000 to $533,000 a unit. I'm not sure how sustainable that is under the current situation for producing affordable housing or for financing affordable housing. And then on the acquisition and rehab side, we're finding for Class C properties that it's costing anywhere from $60,000 to $80,000 a unit to acquire them. And then you have to turn around and invest up between $40,000 and $60,000 per unit just for rehabilitation of those units so that you can then turn around and put them back on the market so that you can produce affordable housing out of existing stock or, as earlier mentioned, out of new construction. So demystifying perceptions around affordable housing. So who are the residents of affordable housing? It's your early career teachers, it's your restaurant workers, students, early career first responders, administrative workers, grocery workers, essential workers, their families, their churchgoers, they're the elderly and retired workers, they're veterans, they're handicapped. Mostly they're people whose values are not atypical with broader society. But too many times we hear reactions to the words affordable housing that unfortunately label a value judge residents of affordable housing unfairly. There's so essential workers. Essential workers are looking for decent places to live and to raise their families, but they need childcare because they fear that when they go out to work, they might bring COVID home to their families. So how can they be situated in housing that addresses those needs for both protection of their family as well as protection of themselves, but also caring for their children while they're gone? And then the other side of it is those families who are not considered to be essential workers. They're experiencing high unemployment because their jobs may have been lost because their employers are shut down, or their work is not considered essential, and so they don't have the opportunities to go in. And what you're seeing from that high unemployment is you're seeing that uptick that was shown in terms of evictions due to hardships. So most nonprofit and community developers provide resident services and support services. And part of the process of providing those is so that our residents, the families that we've been talking to, can be assisted in building assets or building skills or opportunities that they can in turn and eventually do better for their families, providing affordable childcare and after-school programming and educational enhancements so that they can then build skills or they can then identify new opportunities for employment or for themselves becoming employers. Also, we provide communal activities and community building, both pre-COVID and in this era of COVID, we're trying to find new ways to be able to do those and yet provide people with opportunities to social distance and the necessary isolation. Kyle had showed a slide earlier on redlining. And in our earlier discussions, we talked about, is redlining extinct? And is it a thing of the past? I don't know how many of you saw last week's ABC Evening News and Nightline's Turning Point. They ran a story about a Florida family, which that story showed examples of existing redlining in terms of mortgage and appraisals. When the family went to get their home appraised for a refinancing, their initial appraisal came back and they contacted the bank and they were all shocked at how low that appraisal was. The family made some tough decisions and went back out and had the home reappraised. And after those decisions, which meant that they took every family photo out of the house. They took everything that identified the family and genericized the home. And they came back with an appraisal that was $130,000 higher than the original. Same house, same location, same furniture. The only thing that was different was that they took out the family photos, which said who the family was in the house. So yes, redlining still occurs. Redlining occurs both in terms of mortgage and appraisals, but redlining also occurs in terms of insurance, whether it's purchasing health insurance, whether it's purchasing life insurance, whether it's purchasing homeowners insurance. Those are areas that we still see existing or carrying over into redlining, which leads to valuation losses. And when the valuation losses happen, that means that people's personal wealth or community wealth is deteriorating or going away or decreasing. So some opportunities for affordable housing and economic development. Creating development opportunities in communities throughout the city of Houston, improving the quality of schools and education in all communities, economic investment across the city, thereby creating well-paying jobs, infrastructure improvements equitably distributed around the city, creating economic investment funds, which then turn around and invest in neighborhoods and creating opportunities for new businesses, but also creating opportunities for jobs, and then creating an affordable housing investment fund. We recently heard of in Durham, North Carolina, there is a partnership between the city, Duke University, and some other private investors and philanthropy, and they created the Durham Affordable Housing Loan Fund. There's a housing trust fund, and creating a dedicated funding source for that housing trust fund would guarantee that there were funds available for creating affordable housing. There have been discussions here in the city of Houston about creating a housing-based trust fund, and that could assist nonprofit and affordable housing producers to more effectively and efficiently create affordable housing units. Increasing the availability of public, private, and philanthropic subsidies for bridging the affordability gap. As you heard Maria say earlier, in her neighborhood, as well as in one of the neighborhoods that I'm working in, the area median income in that neighborhood is $30,000 for a family of four. In the city of Houston, the area median income for a family of four is $78,000. It's obvious that a family earning $30,000 can't necessarily afford the same as a family earning $80,000. Other opportunities are inclusionary development, mixed income, mixed use, services, jobs, grocery, and retail.
Thanks, Paul. I was just about to interrupt so that we can have Q&A. I know that we want to engage in discussion, so appreciate your perspective and the ambitious vision. There's a lot that we have in terms of opportunity. Next, we have Zoe Middleton from Texas Housers. Zoe leads Texas Housers advocacy work throughout Southeast Texas region. She supports residents in advocating for housing policy change at the local and state level and increasing community access to critical resources. Zoe?
Hello. So just a little bit more on how Housers does what we do. Our mission is to support particularly low and moderate income Texans in their pursuit of a safe, healthy home in a quality neighborhood of their choice. And we do this through technical assistance and we call accompaniment that informs our policy advocacy on local and state levels. That technical assistance can look like a bunch of different things depending on the position and phase and the need of the group that we're working with. We find usually that we are best when there's a three-way collaboration between a base of residents, a supporting community organization, and housers that really lets us spend time with our data and our research, and be as wonkish as possible. So over the last 3 years, we've worked with impact on creosote contamination in the 5th Ward, a group of mothers who are tenants in a few different project-based Section 8 multifamily units or developments here in Houston that are substandard, unhealthy, and frequently flooded. And a group of Harvey survivors in what was the city's homeowner assistance program that was recently taken back by the state. And we have, and hopefully what this graphic attempts to show is that we have kind of a holistic view of housing justice that of course involves the environment, the built environment around one's home, and climate justice as well. And those all have their roots in racial and economic justice. We can go on to the next slide. So I wanted to crystallize what I feel are the issues that we're facing here in Houston. And I think Kyle got at this as well in his presentation, but frankly, the rent is too high and the wages are too low, and that's a state level problem. And the appropriately affordable and healthy housing doesn't exist. And then the thing that could change all of this is, of course, political will. But political will, as we've seen during the kind of public fight over whether or not the city should pursue a grace period ordinance for renters who are behind on rent due to COVID-19, and other recent developments in the city of Houston, including $4 million being allocated just yesterday to the police department of CARES Act money. So we see the political will is low to invest in housing. We'll make a lot of plans, but when it comes to attaching a meaningful budget to those plans and capacity to implement those in departments across the city, we see that will is low. Next slide, please. So I wanted to get a little bit more into the affordable rental housing crisis, and this might be a bit repetitive based on what other presenters have shared, but I think it's important to truly, again, think about who we are building housing for. And so we do not have a shortage of housing at 80% AMI, at 100% AMI. Like that shortage really only, that we have a surplus actually. And the shortage really begins for people at 50% AMI, people who are making 30K and less a year. And what we build reflects our values and our priorities. And we are seeing that we are leaving those people behind in Houston, and that frankly, if we don't build for them, they might not have a place in this city as the city develops forward. Next slide, please. So again, just to give a little bit of a scope to the problem here, this is data that is pulled from the National Low Income Housing Coalition's annual reports. They have one report called Out of Reach and another report called The Gap that talk about necessary housing wages and the supply of housing. So just really quick rundown here of how many renter households are in our region, and the cost that is burdening folks right now. So the rent that is affordable with a full-time minimum wage paying job is $377, and that is not something that the market provides. Next slide, please. And so we really need to think about, the ability of these people to remain in Houston, the necessity of these people to remain in communities they've always been a part of or sought out. And we need to also think about, not only their future, but their present predicament, and just how much they would need to be able to make on an hourly basis, or how much they have to work in order to afford simply to live. And so here you see what we would need the hourly wage to be in order to afford a 1, 2, 3, or 4 bedroom home in the Houston Woodlands Sugarland metro area, which is a catchment area kind of delineated by HUD. Next slide, please. And then we're just talking again about the hours needed to work in order to be able to afford a place to call home. So you're looking at people working upwards of 90 hours a week in order to be able to have a a safe and hopefully a healthy home. Although we know that there are significant issues with the stock in Houston and the affordable housing stock not being healthy. So that is certainly another consideration that we frequently see our partners come up against. And when you're forced to work this much in order to be able to afford a place to live, the shocks are even greater the lower you go down the economic ladder. So a week off work with no paid sick leave is just not an option for some of these people. Next slide, please. But there are some opportunities that I think are really interesting. So Paul mentioned the creation of a housing trust fund. A lot of the ways that housing trust funds are financed across the country are restricted in the state of Texas. Go figure. But an affordable housing bond could be passed, or the trust fund could be seeded with money from philanthropy. And that trust fund could do a few different things. It could staff the Housing and Community Development Department meaningfully. There are currently, I think, only 2.5 fair housing officers, dedicated fair housing officers in HCD right now, which for a city of our size is unacceptable, and they deserve better in order to uphold fair housing standards in the city. You can supplement housing creation dollars. So in the chat, Kyle mentioned LIHTC, a tax credit that's the largest vehicle for the creation of affordable housing in the States. And so you can supplement LIHTC dollars with money from a housing trust fund. You can also supplement the money that comes down from HUD in the form of CDBG entitlement funds or CDBG disaster relief entitlement funds, which create multifamily rental stock for varying periods of affordability. And then you could also work on actually improving habitability and the existing stock. So once again, code enforcement, remediating older homes, making them more climate proof, removing lead paint. I know there's been recent initiatives across the city around lead paint. And then, very timely, we could have a pot of money that we can dip into for emergency rental assistance instead of having to wait for money to flow down from the feds in times of, disaster, hurricane, chemical explosion, and what have you. Other opportunities include true community benefits agreements where the community is a meaningful partner with claw forwards installed so that they have enforcement power, and we're not doing just good faith kind of handshake deals that the laissez-faire Houston culture is known for, but so that we actually see that these investments and speculation on neighborhoods, like you see with the Ion and the East River development, actually try to create some benefit for people in the form of affordable housing or local hire. This one's slightly controversial and very nerdy, but a step away from zero-based budgeting, which is the budgeting procedure that the city of Houston currently uses. There's nothing on its face wrong with zero-based budgeting, but it requires deep trade-offs, and there are no performance measures associated with it, which means that you can get away with simply not funding a program and calling it your legacy program. At the state level, we need a change in landlord-tenant law. Texas is one of the few states that does not have an opportunity to cure or a chance to pay back late rent. Even Mississippi has such a law, I believe. And then finally, we need a paradigm and personality shift in leaders, where we are not simply responding to the will of philanthropy and market investments, and actually using the full power of government and using the processes of government to actually uphold democracy. So I think what we frequently see here is that community engagement is the work of government and does not need to be siloed out to other entities, and listening to people when they ask for certain changes in expenditures or what they're telling you their priorities are is something that we frankly just don't see from the current administration. But it's a second term, and people can be held accountable in their second terms. So yeah, that is my spiel. I'll hand it back for Q&A.
Great, thanks, Zoe.
Thank you.
As we've heard, housing is truly at the nexus of so many quality of life issues. Access to quality schools, proximity to job centers, and other basic necessities, including healthy food, the quality of the air you breathe, as Paul pointed out, and healthy living conditions, just to name a few. Our final panelists will speak to the importance of looking at housing and transportation together, often the first and second largest expenses for low and moderate income families. Jonathan leads policy and planning at Link Houston. He brings his expertise in transportation research and policymaking with an equity lens to his advocacy work and several cross-cutting city and county initiatives addressing transportation access, safety, and climate change in Houston. As a final reminder, if you haven't already, go ahead and submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen as we turn to Q&A after Jonathan. Jonathan, I'll turn it to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Diana. I'll take just a few minutes to talk about transportation, not to diminish the importance of housing, but rather to highlight that housing alone is a significant challenge and critically important. Everyone needs a healthy, acceptable place to live for themselves and their family, but also needs access. And so at Link Houston, we see transportation as the ultimate shared interest. It's also a means to an end. For most people, transportation is not the thing they're trying to achieve, but rather they need to be able to get places. So it touches every family, every person, every business, and every level of government. Transportation is also a cross-cutting issue. It's inextricably linked with where a person lives. And I am by no means a housing expert. I continue to learn things even through this panel itself about housing. That in Houston, it also matters where affordable housing is and the quality of it and its context and how it's connected to the community and to opportunity. And so that is why Link Houston's mission is to advocate for a robust and equitable transportation network so that everyone can reach opportunity. And we should add, while we're not opposed to cars and car ownership, we specifically advocate for any and all ways to improve transportation for people walking, biking, and riding transit, as they are the deeply affordable network. As Zoe pointed out, next slide, please. As Zoe pointed out, the challenge in Houston is especially providing housing for families that need the most deep affordability, that 50% of area median income, 30% of area median income. These are also the households for which transportation can be a very significant expense and liability. Let me explain. Has been stated, Houston has, to some degree, less over time, affordable housing. And I say that with a very strong caveat. But we spend a lot on transportation in Houston, more than other major metro areas. In fact, for the average household in Houston, which earns about $60,000, that household spends about 20% of income on transportation. Less than 15% is considered the goal for transportation. For a moderate income household that earns about $48,000, that number is 22%, which is a very significant portion of income, especially if you look at it just the portion of disposable income. And that has a lot to do with how affordable Houston really is to live. Next slide, please. Every dollar spent on transportation is a dollar not available for housing, healthcare, food, or education. As a result, addressing transportation inequities with housing inequities is kind of a dual tandem step that's critical to advancing economic and social resiliency. I know after Hurricane Harvey, there were several instances publicly reported in the media where individuals were receiving emergency funding, theoretically to help them secure new housing because their housing was, made inhospitable. That instead use those funds to purchase a car because the car was also flooded. And Houston, it's almost more critical that you have a way to get around, especially if you don't live near transportation that's equitable and affordable. And on the screen here, what we've illustrated is that we like to, there are many definitions of equity. And in transportation, it's important to at least have two views. There is personal equity on the left, ensuring that people have opportunities to access at a personal level. And it's not providing the same thing everywhere, but rather strategically making disproportionate investments and improvements in transportation for people walking, biking, and riding transit, so that certain communities where we disinvested in the past due to structural historical racism or other issues, we address those. But There's also community equity. The quality of the built environment in a community is not equal in Houston, and for historical reasons. There's also the distance to opportunity. It may be that ideally we can spur the creation of a grocery store in a community where fresh food has been inaccessible. But if that's not feasible, perhaps we can improve transportation, and improve the frequency of the bus route, the quality of the bus shelters, and the sidewalks and bikeways to and from those stops. Maybe that's more reasonable in certain locations. These are all ways to improve equity. Next slide. So in conclusion, the thought I'd like to leave with everyone is a paradigm. This is a paradigm that we studied this last spring with many of your organizations as part of our task force and with the Kinder Institute. And I'll paste the link on this in the chat afterwards. But essentially in Houston, think about where affordable housing relatively exists and where it does not. But also if you layer in transportation, where is there walking, biking, and transit that's relatively more practical, really fundamentally practical. And you have four zones. Next slide, please. On a map, these 4 zones, the blue areas are where both are in relatively good supply. Opportunity areas that perhaps some families can strive to locate so that they can spend a little more on housing, perhaps to meet so that it's like healthy and meets their needs, but less on transportation. Whereas the opposite, the pink areas are areas where both are in low supply. And it might not be the most advantageous place to invest in either transportation or housing. Green areas are where transportation is not doing as much as it perhaps could. And there are certain areas where improving transit, for example, could have a lot of benefit. And orange areas are where housing is either relatively expensive or less available in terms of units, but transportation is good. And so these are locations where any and all opportunities to buy foreclosed properties, to repurpose them, you create government policies and structures that create affordability in those areas where transportation can mean a household can spend less dollars, because transportation is not the education, it's not the healthcare, it's not the food, it's not the housing, it's just an expense. And the last thought there is with COVID-19, prior to COVID-19, 39% of households, according to the Kinder Houston area survey, did not have $400 in case of an emergency. I know that more recent research post the pandemic is a vast majority of all households. If whatever emergency funds they did have, those are expended. And there's a very tenuous situations out there for most families. And transportation is just a liability. Your car breaks down, you need tires. Any way we can do to create housing opportunity near transportation and vice versa is beneficial. So thank you for keeping that in mind and for the work you all do.
Thanks, Jonathan. I know we've had questions answered through the Q&A feature. I've been scanning them and trying to bring together a question that ties the thread here, but also through the questions that we received via registration. We read through those as well. So I'm going to combine a couple of things here for each of our panelists. Stepping back to think about all of what we heard in terms of the challenges, clearly housing affordability intersecting with kind of an economic insecurity issue and an earning and wage issue. And then also sort of the private market versus the policy levers in place here, local, state, or federal. If you had to kind of choose your one idea or one catalyst that you think would make a big difference in Houston, and also think about how philanthropy could play a positive role in making progress, what comes to mind for each of you? And I'll start with Anne and then go to Paul.
Okay, thanks so much. Just to answer your question, there's like so many things to talk about. I don't know where to start, but essentially, I think because of where we sit, which is the securing land portion, many cities, and actually Paul mentioned a couple of public-private partnerships that really provide some really needed resources to amplify whether it's public sector dollars or private activity. And I think on our side, I know that LISC here locally and a few others have been looking at essentially an acquisition fund. So it would be a public and private partnership fund pool to be able to secure land when we can find it at a relatively affordable rate and lock it in. A lot of smaller organizations can't hold land on their books for a long period of time before it needs to go into development. So securing that land now is critical. So for me, as a catalyst to being able to provide production of many different types of housing that's needed in very different neighborhoods, is to be able to secure the land as quickly as possible. And certainly that is just one piece of the equation, but I think that would go a long way to really having choices to be able to get the development that we want to see in the neighborhoods to support the neighborhood residents.
Great, thanks. Paul?
So I will start where she left off. Yes, getting access to capital to be able to move quickly and to bring things into bear. But I think that and there was a question that was raised in both the Q&A and the chat. I think that there are some public policy things that can happen both at the local level as well as at the state level. The Housing Trust Fund and how it's funded now is a state legislated example of how things could be changed at the state legislature for a dedicated funding source that then turns around, puts money into the opportunities for these deals. Also, if we look at ourselves and we start looking at how and where we interact with people who are maybe different from ourselves, I mean, that's a starting point. And when we can open and expand our own sphere of interactions, then that helps, and that starts a dialogue with people, and people can then start seeing opportunities for themselves personally and for their families and their children. Someone mentioned earlier, the factor of people needing to make more money enables them to be able to overcome a lot of the obstacles where they are. Quick and dirty.
Great, thanks, Paul. Zoe, anything to add to that?
I'll put in an additional plug for, of course, a housing trust fund that has, really deep targeting as a part of its mission, but also the state level policy changes that we just alluded to a little bit before. So those transformations in landlord tenant law could be extraordinarily powerful when you think of, a region like ours that has over 800,000 renters, and this week 482 evictions and 182 eviction hearings. Sorry, 159 today. That is something that we can absolutely control or mitigate the harms of through better landlord-tenant law.
Great, thanks. Jonathan, anything else to add?
I think I'll respond to perhaps a later question about the role of philanthropy broadly.
Okay, great. Another question that came up that sort of speaks to the private sector was from an anonymous attendee earlier. Can you talk more about the incentives developers have to build out small, large, multifamily affordable housing to sort of speak to that gap that Kyle pointed out, or the growing gap that's affordable? With property tax rates being so high, how can it be profitable but also affordable? And he talks about a tax credit, low income housing tax credit, and there are others. But can you kind of, anybody want to unpack a little bit about the challenges of just from a developer standpoint, creating affordable housing in the right places, and what incentives or what barriers could be removed of using these tax credits to facilitate that process? Paul, do you want to take a stab?
Yeah. So all of the inputs that go into producing affordable housing happen to be the same inputs that go into producing not affordable housing. So it's land, it's materials, it's labor, and so as the cost of labor continues to increase, as the cost of materials, whether they are domestically produced or internationally produced, as those things go up, then all of the inputs are going up in terms of affordable housing. we see on an annual basis that there's probably a 4-to-1 oversubscription for the available low-income housing tax credits that are provided in the state of Texas. That tells you that there is high demand for producing them, and what a low-income housing tax credit does is it provides you with the vast majority of the equity needed for a project, which means that the debt side is that much lower because you have the tax credit equity, and the gap is made up through a combination of other public sources and eventually and finally some debt source. So how do you bridge? How does a developer bridge that gap? And what's available to us is, again, available to us is public policy and public will to get increases in those areas. This is not something that is new and only in Houston that we're experiencing this. This is something that's across the country, that there is this crisis in availability of affordable housing. Another opportunity to look at this is from the perspective of what people in these communities and what our communities can afford. If we're able to raise the incomes in neighborhoods, then people will be able to afford more, which means that the gap in affordability can be narrowed. But that's a longer term opportunity. So I think that there are a number of opportunities that we see. Public policy has to be a major part of it, because the programs that exist now for producing the largest amount of affordable housing is oversubscribed 4 or 5 to 1.
Thanks, Paul. Jonathan, I'll let you close us out. So how might individual donors and or philanthropy broadly sort of play a positive role in increasing housing affordability, transportation, access, and equity? What would you encourage listeners to consider doing to support progress on this issue?
Sure, a few thoughts. First, consider what you're already funding. You don't have to reinvent to start making progress on these kind of co-benefit areas. How do people access the things you already fund? So if it's an educational, professional development, if it's a housing site or housing counseling, how do people get to and from? Making sure there's not a barrier there. So being open to funding a line item to support transportation or aspects of housing, and being able to supporting a bit of a premium on housing if it's nearer transit. Sometimes the property costs a little bit more, but there are other benefits there. Second, if you're really wanting to spur systems change, thinking about funding advocacy, I think is a part of the key. Funding advocacy on a local level, in the city and county level, is funding people on the ground that are interacting with the local government and programs that exist and identifying how things could be better. That's a first strong step forward. And thirdly, being willing to fund pilot programs and projects. Philanthropy and funders getting involved in helping government take risk through pilot projects helps government and their partners create partnerships, but also step into progress to learn lessons and then find ways to create momentum there. And finally, one last plug for transportation would be remove stigmas in the way you communicate. And here's an example. When we have an event, we'll talk about first, here's how you get to this meeting or this site or this service, this activity via walking, biking, and transit. That removes the stigma. If you first say, here's how you drive and parking's free, you're telling participants perhaps that's your priority and that was where you considered your site. And so just think about being willing to improve how you already do things, funding advocacy, being open to funding pilot projects and initiatives and programs to find the systems change and seek ways to remove stigma.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Anne also shares in the chat, building capacity of organization is also another place where philanthropy can help. I know that we're closing in on time. Just a quick few closing remarks. A big thank you to all of our speakers for their valuable perspectives today, A thank you to all of you. You're still here listening and learning, and thanks for the great questions. A final thank you to the rest of the GHCF gang behind the scenes for their work to help bring this program to fruition. We wanted to just share a quick note around upcoming programs. We'll include this in a follow-up email, but there are 3 great upcoming programs, including a big picture event if you missed our data briefing earlier in the year, kind of looking at a landscape view of quality of life in Houston. And also on November 12th, join us to release, as we release a philanthropy guide highlighting Black-led nonprofit organizations in Houston as you consider your year-end giving. We'll also send up a follow-up email later this week with a quick feedback survey. We'd greatly appreciate you taking that to kind of help us continue to enhance these program offerings. In that email, we'll include the recording, the slide deck, also a recap blog with key takeaways, recommended readings, and a list of nonprofits working on affordable housing issues in Houston. And for those of you who are GHCF donors or clients, our relationship managers are always here for you if you'd like to have further discussion on this topic or think about your own giving. With that, thank you again so much. We encourage you to follow us on social media, both GHCF and Understanding Houston. We'll include those links in our email as well. And with that, have a great day. Thank you.